Last night at the very end of the show, we reported some breaking news that the Washington Post had just published a news story about the National Security Advisor, Michael Flynn. And it was a very carefully written story. It was long. It had 3 bylines of 3 very big deal reporters from the Washington Post. At one point in the story, they mentioned they had 9 sources for the central claim in their reporting. Whew. Today, the New York Times published their own version of the central claims in that Washington Post story. And, you know, at one level, I can appreciate that this story just kind of looks like, oh, I've heard something about this. Oh, the sinkhole's spreading a little further, right? Seems like an incremental development in the ongoing concerning news about the new administration and its ties to Russia, right? It just feels like an incremental, marginal little shift in something we've been watching for a long time. But if you can step back from the story just for a second, if you can look at it fresh, maybe array some other news stories we already understand around it for the purpose of gaining perspective on it. I think what this new development is about the National Security Advisor is basically like an 800-foot tall dam that's about to be overtopped. This is not a little marginal development in a medium-sized story. This is like an, oh my God, you can't possibly keep running water down this thing. What do you mean we have no choice? She's going to blow. We've got Congressman Adam Schiff from the House Intelligence Committee going to be joining us live in just a moment to give us his perspective on this story. He said today, if this new development, if this new report is true, then the National Security Advisor must be fired. So he obviously thinks it's a big deal, but let me break it down this way. Basic revelation is sort of simple and stunning when you boil it down. Right after Christmas this year, when Barack Obama was still president, the U.S. government announced sanctions against Russia in retaliation for them interfering in our presidential election. You might remember they took back that waterfront compound that had been used by Russian intelligence in Maryland, and they kicked a whole bunch of Russian diplomats out of the country immediately with no notice. And at the time, you might also remember, we were advised to expect retaliation. Tit for tat, right? Whenever we expel diplomats or, seize property or do something like this, there's always a tit for tat reaction between either the Soviet Union and us or now Russia and us. It's been this way for decades. So the Obama administration did their sanctions, kicked the diplomats out on the 28th of December. And we all braced on the 28th of December to hear what Russia was going to do in response. But they did nothing on the 28th. And then on the 29th, there was this entire day in which they also did nothing. And then when they did announce their response on the 30th, their response was, we're not going to respond. It was weird. The Kremlin, expressed its disappointment that Russian diplomats and their families who had been stationed in the United States would now have to be in transit over the Christmas holiday. And that's so sad for the kids from those families. President Putin further explained that he wouldn't be doing any tit-for-tat retaliation. He would not be expelling any American diplomats from Russia. And in fact, American diplomats and their families, their children in particular, would be welcome at the Kremlin to come to his Vladimir Putin Christmas party. It was so weird. But then here's where the Washington Post picks up the story. Quote, Putin's muted response took White House officials by surprise. It triggered a search by U.S. spy agencies for clues. One former senior U.S. official tells the Post, quote, something happened in those 24 hours between Obama's announcement and Putin's response. Officials began poring over intelligence reports, intercepted communications, and diplomatic cables. They found evidence that Trump National Security Advisor Mike Flynn and the Russian ambassador to the United States had communicated by text and telephone around the time these sanctions were announced. Now, one of the nice things about this reporting is we get this kind of blunt admission that, quote, U.S. intelligence and law enforcement agencies routinely monitor communications with Russian diplomats. Okay, I guess we guessed that, but that's good to have bluntly in black and white. One of the other nice things about this reporting is this blunt force take-it-to-the-bank assertion by the Washington Post that their sources on this story are, quote, 9 current and former officials. 9! Who were in senior positions at multiple agencies at the time of the calls. The New York Times similarly cites multiple federal officials who, quote, have read transcripts of the call. So we've got U.S. intelligence and law enforcement agencies bugging the Russians, right, listening in on this Russian official's calls. And what they hear, according to these multiple and multiply corroborated reports, is the man who's going to go on to be Trump's national security advisor calling the Russian government and essentially telling them, don't worry about these sanctions that the U.S. government is putting on you. He's calling Russia to undermine the sanctions that the Obama administration is putting on Russia for their attack on our presidential election. He reportedly told them, in essence, hey, you know what? Don't bother reacting to these sanctions. Don't worry about it. Once Trump is sworn in, we'll fix it. We'll take care of it. Now, working secretly with a foreign power to undermine the actions of the U.S. government, that's kind of a big deal. I mean, even the Trump folks recognized that somebody doing that would be kind of a big deal. They recognized it enough that they took great pains to deny the heck out of this for weeks now.
The subject matter of sanctions or the actions taken by the Obama administration did not come up in the conversation.
They exchanged logistical information on how to initiate and schedule that call. That was it. Plain and simple.
They did not discuss anything having to do with the United States' decision to expel diplomats or impose a censure against Russia. I can confirm that those elements were not part of that discussion.
I can confirm my credibility on the line. So this White House Chief of Staff, White House spokesman, Vice President of the United States, personally confirming there's no way Mike Flynn would have crossed that line. There's no way he would have undermined the U.S. government with a foreign power. There's no way he would have been talking about those sanctions and undermining the impact of those sanctions with the Russians. No way. As of Wednesday this week, Mike Flynn was still confirming to the Washington Post that he absolutely did not speak about those sanctions with Russia. But then when the Post went back to him with this 9-source reporting, all but explicitly quoting what are, we now know, transcripts of the U.S. intelligence intercepts of that phone call, then last night, Mike Flynn apparently changed his mind, now says, I know that I previously said I definitely didn't talk about sanctions. Now I don't remember if I talked about sanctions. So bottom line, how big is this? Is this just a little marginal development in this story that we've all been watching? First thing to appreciate here is the lying, right? Either the White House spokesman, the White House chief of staff, and the vice president all bluntly lied knowingly about Mike Flynn and what he was doing with Russia. Or they lied inadvertently, unknowingly, because they were saying something they thought was true. Because Mike Flynn told them a lie, and they passed it on, thinking it was true. Either way, that can't stand, right? That seems like a big deal for the top people in a brand new administration. You're going to lie to me and have me take it to the American public, and it makes it look like I'm lying? Or you're asking me to lie on your behalf, and I do, and I get nailed for it? Whew. Point one, the lying. Second point to appreciate is the direct bottom line of this story, which is that the senior national security advisor in this new administration personally interfered in U.S. government efforts to punish Russia for interfering in our election. But in terms of assessing the size of this news, I think there's one last point that is starting to feel almost unappreciably big. And that's what I want to put to Congressman Adam Schiff in just a moment because of his experience on the Intelligence Committee. And it is this. Buried in the 7th paragraph of the Washington Post story and in the 4th paragraph of the New York Times story, buried well below the lead, is the news that this discussion between Mike Flynn and the Russian government, undermining U.S. policy toward Russia, undermining the U.S. effort to punish Russia, undermining these sanctions, it wasn't a standalone thing. It was not the, first of many conversations that have continued since the new administration was sworn in and he's become national security advisor. No, that wasn't the start of them talking. Both papers are now reporting, again, with this sourcing that is deep. Both papers are now reporting that Mike Flynn's contacts with the Russian government started during the campaign. Not since he's been national security advisor, not since the transition after Trump was elected when the Obama administration was still technically there, but Trump was on his way in, but while Trump was still running for president during the campaign, while Russia was interfering in the U.S. election to try to elect Donald Trump president, his top national security advisor on the campaign was in repeated contact with the Russian government at that time. Look, this is from the Post. Quote, the talks were part of a series of contacts between Flynn and the Russian official, which began before the November 8th election. Here's the Times. Current and former American officials said the conversation about sanctions was only one in a series of contacts that began before the election. During the campaign, while Russia was interfering in the election, the Trump campaign was in contact with the Russian government. We're now confirming? Really? Okay, well, CNN reports tonight that American intelligence officials have corroborated some of the disputed dossier that was assembled about Trump in Russia by a former British spy who has now disappeared. If you recall this very controversial dossier, which was published by BuzzFeed News, it contained two main allegations. One was that the Russian government had allegedly collected damaging, compromising personal information about Donald Trump that was of a salacious and personal nature. The other main allegation in that dossier was that the Trump campaign colluded with the Russian government while they interfered in our presidential election. Well, CNN reports tonight that intelligence officials, U.S. intelligence officials, who have been investigating that dossier, they have now corroborated parts of it. And again, the two parts are the salacious personal stuff or Donald Trump's campaign collaborated with the Russian government while they interfered in our election. CNN reports tonight that the part that has been corroborated by U.S. intelligence is not the salacious personal stuff. So that leaves. We should note that the White House is disputing CNN's reporting tonight. They're calling it fake news. But that's where we are. Is part of the reason we got this new president not just because some foreign government tried to make that happen? Is part of the reason we got this new president because his campaign worked with a foreign government to influence the outcome of our election, to make that outcome happen? If so, it feels to me like that's not a sinkhole. You know, that's not a busted spillway or an eroded hillside. To me, that feels like blowing the dam.